Chapter 12. Black Hole in My Mind.
My life has been a waste of time. I got a black hole in my mind.
When Izuku finally came around, it was to a pair of shimmering green eyes peering down at him. Izuku registered the concerned crease of a brow, the trembling of a lower lip, the familiar sensation of something warm and soft in his hand. He squinted, willing his vision to focus. "Hi, Mom," he said dazedly. The trembling of Midoriya Inko's lower lip intensified. "Izuku," she wailed. Tears spilled down and over her cheeks. Izuku looked at his mother groggily. Everything seemed a little out of focus. Was this a dream? Why was his mother here? The grip on Izuku's hand tightened, and his gaze shifted downward. At Izuku's side, his mother's hand was entwined with his. He could feel it jittering lightly against his own. This didn't strike him as particularly unusual. The white sheets beneath their hands, however, did. Izuku's eyes followed the sheets over to his right side. It was then that he noticed the four-line trailing from the back of his right hand, secured with medical tape. A clip was attached to the tip of his index finger, its cord running somewhere beyond Izuku's range of vision. He frowned. Inko continued to sob while Izuku distractedly tried to sort out his predicament. "Don't cry," he mumbled as he moved his hand experimentally, watching as the cords followed. He touched the sterile bed sheets, then startled when he realized he was wearing a hospital gown. Where was his winter coat? Where were his boots? His jeans? Right, he'd been outside. He'd been photographing something. A protest. Yes, a protest at a police station. Something tickled the inside of Izuku's nose, and he scrunched up his face in distaste. He moved his hand to brush the thing away and encountered plastic tubing. He tugged at it and felt a pull from around his ears. Inko released Izuku's hand long enough to gently move the other away from his face. Don't pull on that, baby," she said, her voice tremulous. "Leave it be." No, this wasn't right. A lump formed in Izuku's throat. He raised his hand again and followed the tubing around his ear. His fingers brushed heavy gauze. Izuku's gut wrenched. He struggled to push himself upright, a trail of wires following him. The entire room tilted and he swooned, a sudden rush of nausea overtaking him. Inko started. She put her hands on Izuku's shoulders and guided him back towards the pillows. She seemed to sense his agitation, and her gears instantly shifted. "Izuku, no, honey," she said firmly. She brought her hand to his cheek and stroked it comfortingly. "It's okay. Everything's going to be all right." Izuku tried to focus on his mother's face, but his head was swimming. Instead he turned his head to the left, as far as it would go. For some reason his shoulders seemed incredibly stiff. He stared at the small side table by the hospital bed for a full minute before he registered that it was barren. "Where's my camera?" Izuku asked. Inko shook her head softly. "Don't worry about that for now," she said. Izuku tore his gaze away from the table and turned back to his mother. "Where is it?" he repeated. "Oh, excellent," a voice said. "You're awake." Izuku glanced in the direction of the voice. At the foot of the hospital bed stood an elderly doctor with graying hair. She wore a pair of wire-rimmed glasses and was holding a medical chart. When had she gotten there? "He's just woken up," Inko said, wringing her hands. "He seems confused." She pulled a tissue from her purse and blew her nose. The doctor nodded understandingly, then walked around to the side of the bed. "Welcome back," she said, addressing Izuku directly. "My name is Dr. Nakamura. I'll be working closely with you over the next few days. I'm afraid I'll have to insist that you refrain from making any sudden movements for your own safety. Now, we're going to take this slowly. I'll start by asking you a few questions." Izuku stared at the doctor. He didn't understand what she meant by the next few days. All he knew was that he had to get out of there as soon as possible. I need my photographs, Izuku said. I've got to submit them before it's too late. Have you seen my camera? For some reason, Izuku's words seemed to upset Inko. She whimpered, then reached out and tightly grasped her son's hand. Dr. Nakamura glanced at her chart. Ah, yes. The paramedics who arrived on scene reported that you had been enthusiastically reiterating something about photographs, she said. You must have been quite the chatterbox, because the radiologist running your CT was compelled to give you a mild sedative. The doctor smiled sympathetically. I'm sorry, but I don't know anything about any photographs. Perhaps that's something we can sort out in the coming days. For the moment, do you think you could tell me your name? Izuku looked at the doctor wearily. He had no idea what she was talking about. He hadn't spoken to any paramedics or radiologists. I need my camera, Izuku repeated. Sweetie, listen to the doctor, Inko urged. Izuku frowned. He fell silent. Can you tell me your name? The doctor repeated. She watched Izuku intently. Izuku blinked. Midoriya Izuku, he said. Good. Do you know who this is? The doctor gestured towards Inko. My mom, Izuku said, confused by the doctor's line of questioning. What's her name? Midoriya Inko. Excellent. Now, Izuku. Do you know where you are? Izuku stared at the 4-line trailing from the back of his hand and the clip attached to his finger. He felt the cool, steady stream of oxygen flowing into his nasal passages. He looked at the pristine bed sheets, then up at his surroundings. His bed was just one of many in a wide room, and each was surrounded by an assortment of monitors and medical equipment. Many of the machines emitted repetitive beeps and hums. Some beds were occupied, and others were not. A couple were concealed by a simple white curtain. The hospital, Izuku said. Very good, Dr. Nakamura said appraisingly. Here's a trickier one. Can you tell me why you're at the hospital? Izuku opened his mouth to answer and came up short. Why was he at the hospital? The fact that he didn't immediately know was far more unsettling than being there in the first place. There had to be a reason for it. Izuku's sluggish mind worked furiously, but there was no information to retrieve. Eventually he closed his mouth. He looked at the doctor helplessly. Dr. Nakamura seemed to expect this. Not to worry, she said reassuringly, glancing at both Izuku and Inko. It's very common with this type of injury to have difficulty recalling the traumatic event. She paused for a moment to let that sink in. Can you tell me the last thing you remember, Izuku? Izuku tried to piece together what was being inferred. This type of injury. He closed his eyes. Images flashed behind them, fragmented and distorted. Red. Endless red running down the sides of a building. A man with slicked back hair shouting. Was somebody arrested? A chant. No more spilled blood, Izuku muttered. Inko looked at Izuku in horror. The doctor eyed Izuku warily. Are you able to elaborate on that? She asked. Izuku winced. All of this thinking was proving difficult and it was starting to wear him down. A chant, he said. I think. They were shouting it at the protest. Ah, Dr. Nakamura said. Her expression cleared. That's good. Very good. She smiled comfortingly at Inko. A protest. Inko exclaimed suddenly. Her eyes filled with tears again. Izuku, what were you thinking? To go off and do something so dangerous, Inko looked away from him. She sniffled and rubbed her nose. A pang of guilt ran through Izuku. I was thinking I'd get some really good photographs, he said slowly. I'm going to send them to the news outlets I researched and have them published. Once I've been released I'll clean them up and shoot them off. What time is it? Inko shook her head a few times, speechless. It's mid-afternoon, Dr. Nakamura supplied calmly. She added a few notes to Izuku's medical chart. The sedative we administered was only enough to allow the radiologist to run your scans without interruption. Izuku groaned. Mid-afternoon. There wasn't a lot time left, but if he rushed, he could still swing it. He had to. The doctor pulled up a chair next to Inko and took a seat. I believe that you are lucid enough to be made aware of your situation, she said to Izuku. Your mother has already been filled in. She paused. You may find some of this information upsetting, but please know that you are in very good hands. Okay, Izuku said. As far as he was concerned, the sooner he knew why he was in the hospital, the sooner he could focus on getting out. You recall that you were at a protest, Dr. Nakamura began. That's very good. She set Izuku's chart down on her lap. The paramedics who attended to you were informed by several witnesses that your injuries were sustained by an assailant wielding a baseball bat. My baby, Inko moaned. She inched closer to Izuku and rubbed his arm soothingly. Izuku only felt confused. Someone had attacked him with a baseball bat. He was pretty sure he'd have remembered that. Your CT scan and X-rays have revealed no fractures or ruptured organs, the doctor continued. You have some bruising on your ribs, but none of them are broken. Your spine and neck appear to have been missed entirely. Your right shoulder was identified as the primary site of impact, with the back of your head as the secondary site. You're very fortunate, your injuries could have been much worse. Izuku slogged through the doctor's words, trying to focus on their meaning. He didn't feel particularly fortunate. After a long pause he gestured towards the gauze on his head. What about this? He asked. Dr. Nakamura considered her words. You sustained blunt force trauma to the back of your skull during the assault, she said carefully. Your CT shows evidence of cerebral contusion. In layman's terms, your brain has been bruised. You will likely also experience the symptoms of a concussion. A longer pause. There is a small laceration of the scalp where the bat struck you. We've closed it with a few staples. There is also some mild bleeding in your brain. At this point we do not believe that any invasive intervention is required. However, we will be monitoring you closely over the next several days in the Ensaku for signs of swelling and any increases in intracranial pressure. You will be released once we have confirmed you as stable. Izuku processed the doctor's words slowly. They were partially incomprehensible to him in his current state, but he had caught a few key phrases here and there. One of them in particular was highly distressing. Over the next several days, he repeated in disbelief. I can't be in here for days. I have to submit my photographs today. Is there any way I can be released sooner? Absolutely not, the doctor replied without hesitation. You are being kept in the Ensaku for a reason. You may not feel critically ill, but your injuries are serious. Your recovery depends on a number of conditions being met that only close monitoring can provide. Should you try to move recklessly or leave preemptively, you could sustain a secondary injury far worse than your current. But... Izuku! Inko cried out in exasperation. Her gaze was livid despite the trails of tears that stained her cheeks. Would you please show a little more concern for your own well-being? Izuku opened and closed his mouth. There were 100 things he wanted to say, but the expression on his mother's face froze his tongue. He'd worried her. Frightened her, even. His lips twisted unhappily. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it. But, my camera. Inko sighed and stroked Izuku's hand. Sweetie, she said. I'm not sure where your camera is. You might have dropped it when, Inko's eyes began to well up. Maybe a good Samaritan picked it up, she said hopefully. You never know. We can look for it together once you're better. Izuku's face fell. So that was it? His camera was missing, and he'd been relegated to a hospital bed. He could tell that his mother was trying to put on a positive face for him. Maybe, Izuku replied, though his heart said otherwise. Inko offered Izuku a wobbly smile. Izuku closed his eyes. Conversing was proving more and more difficult, and his head was beginning to throb. It was all too much for him to process, so he focused on the predictable beeps and hums of the machines around him instead. Maybe his mother was right, he thought desperately. Maybe his camera was out there waiting for him, full of photographs ready to be published. Need to be confident that you will not try to leave, the doctor was saying. If necessary, we will use restraints, but we'd rather it not come to that. Can we trust you, Izuku? Izuku. Yeah, Izuku heard himself say. I won't try to leave. Good, Dr. Nakamura said. I'm glad to hear it. Please get some rest for now. The sound of a chair being pushed back floated through his head. The nurses will be coming by to check on him frequently. We'll be conducting regular tests as well. Visiting hours are strict in intensive care, but we'll contact you immediately should any issues arise. Thank you. I'll need to leave to collect a few things from his apartment shortly, but, can I stay for just a few more minutes? Of course. Please take good care of my boy. I will. When Izuku awoke next, it was evening. The fog in his head cleared more quickly this time, although Izuku was still plagued with strange sensations. The lights in the Ensaku had been dimmed in areas, one of two indicators as to the time of day. The other was the dinner tray that the nurse who had gently roused Izuku had brought. Before she gave it to him, the nurse examined Izuku's monitors, made a few notes on his chart and checked his 4 fluids. She then sat down and asked Izuku to answer a series of simple questions. This was followed by having him complete a number of simple motion and reflex tests. Izuku was surprised to learn that his coordination was not as good as he'd thought it was. He was able to complete the tests, but he'd had to concentrate on his movements and especially their endpoints. Once Izuku had done everything to the nurse's satisfaction, she slowly adjusted Izuku's bed until he was seated in a more upright position. She set up his meal tray, then gave him a few basic instructions and showed him how to buzz for assistance. As Izuku carefully worked his way through the less than thrilling hospital meal, he took some time to mull things over. Things could be worse, he decided with as much resolve as he could muster. His camera was only missing. He was pretty sure the doctor who he had spoken with earlier had said something about there having been witnesses to the incident. Perhaps one of them had picked it up. Maybe a police officer had taken it in as evidence. Izuku smiled softly, latching onto the thought. His photographs wouldn't make it onto the evening news, but maybe there was another route he could take. Hell, maybe he could write his own article about the protest. He wasn't about to let the blonde with the slicked back hair down. Monoma, Izuku remembered. Then there was Katsuki. It went without saying that Katsuki didn't need to know about what had happened. Izuku couldn't imagine many people were aware that he'd been admitted to the hospital in the first place. Besides, Izuku really didn't want to think about how Katsuki might react upon learning that Izuku had gotten himself injured after Katsuki had specifically warned him to be careful. Izuku became so wrapped up in his thoughts that he barely registered the sidelong glances from passing hospital personnel. Izuku made it halfway through his meal before he lost his fork. He watched it tumble to the ground with helpless amusement. When his eyes lifted, he noticed that a small collection of items had been placed on his bedside table. A modest bouquet with a small card propped against its vase. A pair of pajamas from his apartment. His phone charger and phone. A handful of newly purchased photography magazines. An extremely old All Might plushie from his childhood bedroom. Izuku flushed. He couldn't believe his mother had brought that last item to the hospital. Deciphering Inko's handwriting was difficult in his current state, but by the time that Izuku had gotten through the card, he was smiling. His mother really was amazing. If nothing else about this situation made him feel fortunate, that did. He really ought to thank her. Izuku was sure he'd see her tomorrow, but there was no harm in sending her a quick message before then. Izuku picked up his phone and was immediately bombarded with notifications. Izuku rubbed his eyes in disbelief. What the? As Izuku slowly worked his way through the messages, his heart plummeted. Holy hell, Midoriya. Are you okay? Izuku. Please tell me that wasn't you I just saw. Midoriya. People who he hadn't talked to in months. Friends. Co-workers. His throat constricting, Izuku thumbed over to a text from Shoto. Shoto, of all people. Midoriya. Tenya just contacted me. He said there'd been some sort of assault. Izuku quickly abandoned Shoto's message. It didn't take him long to track down Itsu's. Midoriya. I am watching the evening news. Are you badly injured? You must let me know right away. Which hospital are you staying at? The evening news. Something had made it onto the news. Izuku was ready to dig up whatever had been broadcast when another message caught his attention. Bro. We just heard about the protest. Are you alright? Bakugo is pissed. Said he'd told you about the whole thing. I didn't even know you guys were talking. But seriously, you okay, man? Izuku whimpered. Out of all the reasons that Kirishima could have chosen to get back in touch with him, this had to be the one. Katsuki knew. Izuku wanted to sink into the hospital bed and disappear. He'd screwed up, and Katsuki knew. The glare from Izuku's phone pierced his eyes like daggers, but he couldn't look away. Izuku frantically searched and scrolled as best he could until he found the clip that he was looking for. It wasn't a long segment. As Izuku watched, his horror compounded. A protest held outside the police station at Danforth and Maine this morning turned violent when protesters pitted their fists against the station's officers. While no officers were harmed in the ensuing brawl, a photographer who appears to have been documenting the situation suffered serious injury when a group of looters took notice. Shaky footage clearly taken from someone's cell phone replaced the news anchor's likeness. The man continued to talk, but Izuku was only able to focus on the poor quality video. Izuku recognized himself instantly. Two other individuals were in the shot. One of them was holding a baseball bat as he approached. Izuku wasn't entirely sure why, but the teenage girl seemed familiar while the tattooed man struck no recognition within him whatsoever. Izuku felt like he had been betrayed by his own mind. At one point you can hear the young photographer attempting to placate his assailant. The Izuku on screen was doubled over. Izuku could see his camera, hanging from its strap around his neck. One of Izuku's hands was held out. A garbled wait could be heard over the street noise. Everything happened very quickly. The man swung the bat over Izuku's head. Izuku ducked, but it wasn't low enough to avoid the blow. The bat struck him hard, its end connecting over his shoulder and the shaft striking him in the back of the head. It was disturbing to see just how quickly he went down. Izuku sucked in a sharp breath as he watched himself collapse face first onto the pavement. He lay there completely motionless. Izuku groaned. He raised his hand to his nose. Sure enough, he could feel the telltale roughness of a scab that had formed along one side of it. Everyone who had messaged Izuku had probably seen this news clip. Itsu had seen it. Shoto had seen it. His mother had probably seen it. Kirishima. Katsuki. Izuku bit his lip to keep a wail of dismay at bay. This was a level of public humiliation that he was unused to. Izuku had gone to the protest to make a name for himself, to document events in real time. Instead he had been the one who'd been documented. Even while Izuku berated himself, the video continued. The teenage girl shrieked with glee as she approached Izuku's prone form. She crouched down in front of him. The quality of the video made it difficult to pick up small movements, but it looked an awful lot like the girl was dragging a finger over the back of Izuku's head. She brought her finger to her mouth and licked it. Izuku sincerely hoped that he had misread the girl's actions. He didn't even want to think about the potential reasons for them. He touched the back of his head self-consciously and shuddered. Half a second later, Izuku forgot her actions entirely. As the girl lifted Izuku's camera up and over his head, Izuku's blood ran cold. "No," he whispered, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene. The girl held the camera up to her face. "Crack" was the only word that Izuku was able to discern. The tattooed man swung the bat over his shoulder. "Whatever you want," he replied. The girl whooped. In one easy motion she flipped the camera and ejected its memory card. She passed the tiny device to the man, who then tossed the wooden bat towards the girl. The man snapped the card in half and shoved the remains into his coat pocket. Izuku felt the snap like a broken bone. The girl dumped Izuku's camera on the ground. She dragged the camera bag off his body and shoved it towards the man. The man rifled through its contents while the girl got to her feet and patted herself off. With one final shriek, the girl brought her leg back and kicked Izuku's camera at full force. The camera skittered along the ground and smacked into the front of the pawn shop. The girl's giddy laughter could be clearly heard over the sounds of the protest as she wildly swung the baseball bat and struck the camera with repeated blows. It was over in a matter of seconds, but it felt like eons. Every time the bat struck the camera was a punch to Izuku's gut. He couldn't breathe. His hands shook. The pain that he felt as he watched his camera get smashed to pieces was all too real. As the bat began to splinter under repeated impact, Izuku felt a fierce urge to throw his phone across the room. It wouldn't stop the assault though. It was already too late. The video was merely replaying events that had happened earlier that day. The powerlessness that Izuku felt in that moment was overwhelming. The girl didn't stop swinging until one of Izuku's most prized possessions had become an unidentifiable mass of broken metal, glass, and plastic on the ground. A disembodied voice shouted at the group from off-screen seconds later. The group looked towards the source of the voice, turned, and fled. The photographer has since been taken to a local hospital. His condition and identity are presently unknown. Police are asking that anyone with information about the suspects in the video come forward. Izuku set his phone down in his lap. His breathing was shallow. His photos. His camera. His work. Everything was gone. This couldn't be real. He must be having a bad dream. Izuku picked up his phone. He watched the video over and over again. By the fourth replay, Izuku's head felt like it was going to explode. Izuku thought about the photos that he had taken at the protest. He thought about Monoma's hard work. He thought about the news outlets that he had contacted. The amount of time he'd spent preparing. The man who had taken a chance on him and passed along a contact. The protesters who had been counting on him. Izuku had let everyone down. This awful knowledge struck Izuku harder than any baseball bat could. Izuku's first attempt at playing photojournalist was a total failure. His camera was gone. No, it was worse than gone. It had ceased to be, taken to pieces by someone who had no concept of how much it had meant to him. Izuku had saved all through college in order to buy that camera. His mother had scrounged and bought him that expensive lens as a graduation gift. Izuku had carried it around with him nearly every day since, an extension of his own body. It was the camera that he'd taken on all his jobs to date. That he'd used to shoot with Rick. To shoot the anti-heroes. Izuku's head throbbed. It was too much to bear, too horrible for any amount of tears. Izuku had always prided himself on being able to look on the bright side of things, to find the silver lining in a bad situation. As the nurse took Izuku's unfinished meal tray away and readjusted his position, he searched for it desperately, but came up empty. How was he supposed to come back from this? How could Izuku be a photographer without a camera? He had some money in savings, but it wasn't enough to buy a replacement. Of course he'd continue setting money aside from his day job, but judging by how that had been going, it would be at least another year before he could afford a new camera. How could he be expected to wait that long? Izuku had followed his dreams, and this was where it had gotten him. Everything that he'd worked towards in his entire life up until now suddenly felt very far away and incredibly pointless. Izuku picked his phone up again. He needed a distraction. Izuku read the messages that continued to pour in. He tried to take solace in them. These were all from people who cared about him. He ought to feel lucky. He'd let them down too. Izuku could feel his face pinching up. He owed everybody who'd messaged him a response, but there were far too many. The most he could manage was a general status update reassuring his acquaintances and thanking them for their concern, and a small handful of personal replies to a few of his good friends. After some consideration, he sent a reply to Kiri's him as well. Typing was excessively difficult. Izuku's fingers sloppily navigated the keys. He definitely let more than one typo slide, but it was the best he could do. Izuku tried to rest after that, but he couldn't lay still. Within minutes, he was back on his phone, watching the same video on repeat. It wasn't until one of the nurses came by and threatened to take his phone away that Izuku set it aside. By then, his head was reeling, his eyes were burning and he was on the verge of throwing up. Izuku lay in bed, clenching and unclenching his fists. He dug his fingernails into his palms. His camera had been destroyed while he'd been lying on the ground mere feet away. Izuku had practically let it happen. He might as well have destroyed it himself. The breathing apparatus was beginning to itch Izuku's face. Izuku was struck with the sudden violent urge to rip it out of his nose. He wanted to pull these wires off of him and tear the line from his veins. He'd get out of this hospital bed and run until he had escaped this reality. He probably wouldn't get very far before he succumbed to his injuries, but it'd be worth it. Izuku pounded his fist against the bed in frustration, stifling a cry when he missed entirely and hit his injured side. Izuku swiped angrily at the tears of pain that welled in his eyes. He looked at the items his mother had brought him. Izuku hesitated, then with a hasty movement reached out and grabbed his old All Might plushie. He pulled it into his arms and buried his face in its worn fabric. Somewhere around the rush of oxygen, he could faintly smell the familiar scent of childhood, of home. Maybe if he held it tightly enough, he could make himself stop shaking. In the dim lights of the Ensaku, surrounded by the consistent beeping and humming of machines, Izuku clung to that old plushie, feeling very small and very much alone.